Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television with me, Frank Pereira. Stating that it will not regulate media content, the Supreme Court on Thursday said that the role of a court or a statutory authority will come in only after a complaint is levelled against a telecast or publication. A bench led by Chief Justice of India, J.S. Kehar, made it clear that pre-broadcast or pre-publication censorship is not the business of the court and that all grievances against objectionable content will be dealt with in accordance with the law of the land after its publication. The bench, also comprising Justice D.Y. Chandrachud, underscored the right of the media as enshrined under Article 19(1)(a) of the Constitution that guarantees freedom of speech and expression. The court was hearing a clutch of PILs led by an NGO which demanded a regulatory body for the media on the ground that the centre had failed to regulate content of the broadcast media. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyse the order of the Supreme Court and discuss if the media should be regulated or not. Joining me on the program today are Sevanti Nainan, editor, thehoot.org, Professor Mridula, Mukherjee, historian, Sanjay, Hegde, senior advocate of the Supreme Court, and Navin, Upadhyay, political editor of The Pioneer. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Sanjay, Hegde, I'd like to start with you, of course, and if you could throw some light on the observation of the Supreme Court and put it into perspective for us as to what the Supreme Court observed.
You see, the point is that we don't have a regulatory body for the electronic media in the country. A lot of private channels have by themselves set up the National Broadcasting Standards of India with a retired Supreme Court judge heading it, but that is largely self-regulation. In addition to that, most of these channels operate under the framework of the cable network regulations, and that does not have any prior regulatory body. But you will also remember that if something goes wrong, then the ministry steps in and punishes the channels by sometimes taking them off the air for a day or so. The question that was urged before the Supreme Court by Common Cause, which was argued by Prashant Bhushan and by a few other petitioners, was that India needed a regulatory body which had to be set up with statutory backing so that complaints could go on an ongoing basis. The Supreme Court has refused to get into that thicket. In one way, it says that, look, that could possibly be legislation, and there is already an existing framework where if anything goes wrong, you can either approach the courts in defamation, either civil or criminal, or you can approach the ministry and ask it to take action after the event. Prior regulation, the Supreme Court said, that was a field that it did not want to get into. And with that, they have wrapped up this series of writ petitions. They have disposed those writ petitions off.
Sevanti Nainan, is there a need for a regulatory body to regulate the media and the kind of content that is generated almost on a daily basis? You've seen the amount of content that is generated today is immense.
There is a need for regulation for any sector. TRAI regulates telecom. The Cable Regulation Act is only supposed to regulate cable distribution. It is not supposed to do anything about regulating broadcasting content. The Supreme Court itself in 1995 had said two things, that the airwaves belong to the people and that you have to set up an independent regulatory authority to regulate them. You see, a lot of civilized countries have regulators. You have regulators because in other countries, channels are licensed. Somebody has to do the licensing based on certain parameters. You need regulation for other reasons also. Basically, regulation sets out a broad framework within which you're supposed to operate, things you broadly do and broadly don't do. Now, it may not suit, I mean, there have been three efforts, let's be very clear. There have been three efforts starting from 1997 to bring broadcasting regulation. It has never gone through. The last was in 2012. Because it doesn't suit the government and it doesn't suit the industry.
Indeed. All right. Professor Mukherjee, self-regulation, the NBC has been talking about it, talking about how televisions and publication houses have managed to contain this problem within themselves. Has it really worked?
No. I think there are two issues. One is the issue of whether there should be a regulatory body, and I think most important, what should be its role. That's how I see it. But where there's a question comes of pre-censorship, or, you know, content which is yet to go on, how that can be regulated. To me, out sheer logically speaking, the Supreme Court order seems the right one, because I would not like a situation in which, in any field, whether it's publication or whether it's the printing press or whether it's the visual media or whatever, or the net, that you have a system of pre-censorship. That would be, you know, an absurd situation, I think. Regulation where you're setting down norms and a place where you can make complaints, that's a completely separate thing altogether. And as far as I read the news this morning, the Supreme Court did say that there was room for setting up for the government. They advised the government to set up a body where on a regular basis people could go with complaints if and when they wanted, and it could work. So I mean, I personally buy into the order where it says that according to the fundamental rights of freedom of speech and expression, they do not want to get into anything which smacks of pre-censorship.
Indeed.
And I think that's important to safeguard liberties. See, we are here talking about regulating content which is objectionable, let's say from a social point of view, misogynist, whatever, you know, based on, I mean, defamatory, which is not. But what about a situation in which a body like this is used by governments to actually pre-censor stuff? You know, there's also that possibility then of a body like that being used, and more chances of that happening than of
how transparent will a body like that
or
be?
vulgar content or misogynist content being actually weeded out.
Indeed.
It seemed to me.
Indeed. Indeed. You wanted to make a point on that?
No, I just want to say that a body like that will have independent members also. It will have all kinds of representation on it, and it is something everybody does everywhere. You have a regulator. Regulation is not either pre-censorship or censorship. It is laying down rules. Then you have a complaints council, and then if you violate the rules too often, you lose your license. But we don't have licensing, we don't have a complaints council, so we don't have a regulator either. So there's a whole network needed which is not there.
Indeed. Indeed.
We do have licensing for uplinking.
Only uplinking,
Yes.
done by the ministry, completely unilateral.
Sure, sure. Navin Upadhyay, I want to bring you into the picture as well. You know, the sheer amount of content that is generated today, in today's day and age. You have the social media, you have television, you have radio, you have newspapers, and you have the internet. I mean, the content that is generated, can that be channelized? Can that be really, you know, looked at on a daily basis from time to time and see what kind of content is being put out there?
You see, I think that cannot be done. One can only, that is a very generic thing, and this cannot be done when at a time when you have millions and millions of news feeds coming out every day. What can be done, that if there is a specific issue, you know, if something is specific which is defamatory, which is anti-national or whatever, you know, that can be addressed. And for that, I think there is a burning need to set up a regulatory body which I think Prashant Bhushan is right in saying it should have a statutory backing. Otherwise, I mean, you know, self-regulation has not worked in this country, and media's credibility is at stake, because you see, especially in television channels, you have a lot of unscrupulous elements, starting channels at local level. I think that thousands and thousands of television channels, I think there should be an investigation into their funding. I personally feel that they are doing a lot of harm to journalism, and they are involved in a lot of other rackets. So, and if you just look at their contents, I think they are quite, you know, scandalous. So, they are, in fact, you know, they are hurting the interest of the mainstream media, which is responsible to a great extent. So, I personally feel there should be a very powerful and powerful regulatory body which has the, you know, some sort of power to really regulate it and punish people who are involved in spreading news which is totally defamatory or harms the interest of the society or otherwise.
Indeed, indeed. Sanjay Hegde, the problem with, you know, having a regulatory body and setting up something like that is the fact that the Constitution safeguards the media under Article 19(1)(a). So you have the freedom of speech. So the journalists time and again say that we have the freedom of speech, so we'll go out and put out that content.
Well, to be quite honest, there's no special freedom of speech for the media.
Under Article 19.
under 19(1)(a), it's the same freedom of speech which is available to the citizen as well as the media at large. The point is that we don't have an unregulated freedom of speech. It can be subject to reasonable restrictions. Now, the point of having a regulator is a different point than having a censor.
Yes.
A regulator will not only give out broad norms that these things can be considered objectionable. So therefore, the flags are put out in advance. Then if somebody violates those regulations, then there should be a mechanism to deal with it, and that mechanism will be in accordance with natural justice. People are given notices, and there is a hearing, and the entire procedure is laid down. I don't think that the industry should object to that, and in fact the industry should welcome it. But whenever a government tried to bring it in, they fobbed it out with something or the other, and this National Broadcasting Standards Authority was also set up by a few private media houses. Now, some of the big players did accept it on a voluntary basis. But at the end of the day, that body is a toothless tiger. What can it do except say, thou shalt not do it? Maybe fine them 1 lakh or 2 lakhs, and or ask them to publish a retraction. Whereas, if you give it statutory backing, there can be sterner punishments for repeat offenders. And though its judgments would carry almost the same weight as the judgments of a court of law. This would also, to a certain extent, help the media insofar as defamation cases are concerned. Rather than a media house being hit about 20 years down the line when a defamation suit finally concludes with a huge amount of damages, there can be a speedier procedure dealing with transgressions within the media.
Indeed.
It is ultimately a call for the industry, the private sector of it, to take whether they want to continue in an unregulated atmosphere with something like a figurehead voluntary consensus of a regulator, or do they want it to be put on a statutory basis.
Indeed. Yes, Sevanti, you want to make a point?
It's not just a call for industry. It's a call for civil society also, which is what Common Cause represents. That's one. Two, I just want to say that the News Broadcasters Authority, the statutory thing, covers 20% of the channels. Everybody is not a member. If you're a member, it applies to you. Everybody is not a member. A lot of regional channels are left out. You have to go to Andhra Pradesh, which has 15 news channels, to see the complete rat that they run with news TV over there. So a lot of regional channels are not covered by them.
Indeed, a lot of regional channels are not covered by them. But as far as the industry is concerned, Navin Upadhyay, do you want a regulated kind of an atmosphere, or is what is happening right now so that is welcome for the industry?
You see, as I said before, there is a need for regulation. Otherwise, media's credibility is at stake. But I don't think this regulation should come from government. I think it should be some sort of media should evolve it. Maybe I think you can have retired judges, you can have experts, and this should be backed by law. So, and it should give speedy disposal of cases. What happens if you file a defamation case or whatever, it takes years, and the person finally does not have the might to fight a media empire. Many cases, people, I just remember, I don't remember a case where somebody has won a big defamation against a media house because people cannot fight. And in many cases, grave injustice is done to those victims of media's, excesses. So I personally feel that in most cases journalists are responsible, but there are also issues now when you have cross-holding in media, you have corporate interest, you have political interest, market interest, and all these interests are, working on media, and sometimes media get used by them, and there are comes out with reports for which is doing damage to corporate interests and otherwise also. So I think, there is a need for regulation. That regulation should not be interfered by the government. It should evolve itself. It should be backed by law. And it should give speedy justice to the victim of media's excess.
Professor Mukherjee, is it time to relook our laws, our media laws, maybe bring in some new legislations to protect, to safeguard some media houses, and also to ensure that the kind of content is put out and generated is, is looked at closely?
What I'm not able to follow in this debate is why do we need something different from what we have for the print media? We have had a functioning print media now for almost 200 years, right? Systems have evolved. The same law of freedom of expression applies to the print media. Whatever regulatory mechanisms we have in place, I think we could just duplicate that for the visual media, because there's what I'm concerned about is, yes, regulation, as I said, the way it's worked for with all its fault, you have cross-holding in the print media, you have big interests, business interests over there. I don't think we should get into that. But this is part of the baggage of a free press that we have in an open society. We can't, start investigating sources of funding and this and that and the other, because that's where I think we can land up in trouble, because then interested parties can use that in order to control. I think it's a very fine balance that you have to maintain between the freedom that is absolutely necessary and the regulation which is also absolutely necessary. So I think a tried and tested system which has guaranteed us a reasonably free press till now, it works in this country. I think that's the kind of model I would like to be replicated. I don't see why we need anything different.
Indeed, indeed.
In fact, Justice Karju, who headed the Press Council of India, suggested that even the electronic media be handed over to the Press Council and the complaints could be dealt with under the Press Council procedure. Of course, every judicial, quasi-judicial authority in India does like to expand its ambit. So that suggestion coming from him was probably not welcomed at that point of time. But you can take a relook. Justice Karju has been followed by Justice Chandramouli Prasad. But on the other hand, the National Broadcasting Authority, which has been set up in the private sector, which only 20% contribute to, that also has a very respected retired judge, Justice Ravindran. The only difference between Justice Ravindran's order and the Press Council order is that Justice Ravindran's order does not have statutory backing. If somebody decides that he does not like the order, the next thing that they do is that they just withdraw from the authority altogether. So that has to depend on the consensus of the channels to work. Justice Ravindran is still dependent on the goodwill of the channels.
Indeed.
You need to give him statutory power.
Yes, you want to say
The Press Council has no statutory powers. It's a recommendatory body. It does not have power.
But it works under a statute,
Yeah.
and those recommendations do have some at least some legal flavor, if not effectiveness.
Okay, but we also have to remember they're very different medium. No country in the world has press regulation. Everybody has electronic regulation. It's a powerful medium. It can cause damage.
The Supreme Court has also asked the government to set up a statutory body for a complaints redressal mechanism. Now, under Section 22 of the Cable Television Networks Regulation Act, what kind of powers does the INB ministry have to set up a body like this?
No, you see, if the ministry is asked to set up a body, very often it will be 2 members from the Indian Information Service, 1 member from the IAS, and some retired journalist or the other, to give it a flavor of completeness. But more or less, you would find not so much of regulation as throwing the book at somebody who probably has not been kind to the powers that be. Very often that is likely to happen. To my mind, a permanent body with an infrastructure available to deal with complaints from all over India, with also judicial or quasi-judicial members, and more particularly 1 or 2 lay members, that is members of the ordinary viewing public, also invited. That would have much more credibility.
Indeed, indeed. Sevanti, you were speaking about some best practices earlier in the program. Are there some best practices that we can probably use, that we can adopt in India at this given time, so as to ensure that the kind of content that is generated is put out in the right way?
First of all, we're talking about if there's a regulator, it's done by law. So it's not IND ministry, it's what? Law and Justice. Who drafts laws?
No, Parliament
will
pass it. It will be the legislative wing of the law ministry.
The law ministry. It would not be drafted by, so we can't go to bodies.
The enforcing ministry will still be the INB ministry. That's the
why?
That's the catch.
Why?
Like the TRA Act. Ultimately, it goes to the telecom ministry. So it's like that.
Okay, but that's the distinction. So it's not a question of best practices. I think you have to look at the most. I think you need a law, personally, and I think the law has to be as broad-minded and mindful of what it's trying to do. And if you draft a good law, first of all, it won't get passed, but that is the problem. So there is no really, I mean, there's no body shoddy that I think should be doing it. I think there should be statutory backing. And I don't think the cable, you know what happens in the Cable Regulation Act? The DM has powers, the district magistrate in any district, to just order off the channel. And, you know, so that's a content thing. He doesn't like the content, somebody goes to him with a complaint, he orders it off. So it cannot be part of a cable regulation, because a cable regulation is just carriage. So there is a problem, there is a missing law somewhere. If you can't pass it, then I don't know what the solution is.
Navin Upadhyay, do you see a solution in sight? Because my panelists here don't think that there could be a solution anytime in the near future, but can you come up with a solution or suggest something?
I think there has to be a solution, you know, because things definitely, you know, they demand, and things have changed during the last 20 years, you know. I mean, 20 years ago this was not needed because there were few media houses, and but now if you see, everywhere you have hundreds of television channels and print media. In that situation, when there were few media houses, I think it was easier for them to be, you know, self-regulation. But now I think it's impossible. So we need an institution. We need an institution which is not controlled by government. I think this should not be an excuse for government to regulate media. I think media houses will have to sit among themselves and decide, you know, and then perhaps they can go to the government, and perhaps, you know, it can get some sort of legal cover. But otherwise, I think if we allow things to drift this way, I think media's credibility will take a big hit in the long run. If you know, if you open newspapers or television channels on daily basis, and if you look at them closely, you will find, I mean, there are outrageous reports which have no backing. And if you read 5 different newspapers or watch 5 different channels, they are interpreted in a way which gives an entirely different meaning. I think there is a lot of, you know, there is a need for regulation in that sense also. Because people are pursuing in today's world, where corporate and political interests are dominating media, I think there is a burning need for self-regulation.
All right. Yes, so Professor Mukherjee, you want to make a
I
point?
wanted to say that, you know, we're still in the range of less than a few thousand TV channels. I think they're probably about 1,500 or something
More than any other country in the world.
Fine. But we have thousands of newspapers in so many Indian languages. I mean, and we've not gone under. There's always been a yellow press. I mean, I've read the newspapers during the colonial times for my historical research. Scurrilous. You know, I mean, communal, scurrilous, you name it. I'm saying we've lived with it. We haven't gone under. Regulations are there. The law is there. But we have to be very careful, you know, that we do not throw the baby with the bathwater. I also think it's very necessary for us to realize the times we are living in, where a lot of people would like to control media for a lot of reasons which may not be concerning you and me, but do concern a lot of other people. So I think we have to be very careful about this.
Indeed. I've got about, yeah.
If
Please.
there is a regulatory body, and if there is a specific complaint, I mean, it does not harm the media from publishing other news. I mean, there is truth. Only this regulatory body should step in, only if there is a specific grievance, and if there is distortion of news for some ulterior motive. Sure. And I think that will help media. It will not, you know, it is not going to hamper the freedom of press. I think it will give us, you know, more acceptability among the people.
I think that's what the Supreme Court has spoken about also, of having, a complaints redressal mechanism in place so as to look at some of these cases in the near future. But I've got about 2 minutes left on the program, so I'd like to get, final views from all my panelists, starting with you, Sanjay Hegde. What's the way forward?
The way forward ultimately has to be legislation, because without legislation, whatever you put in will be a stopgap measure. If legislation gets it wrong, it can always be amended.
Right.
But the point is that the electronic media is here to stay. There is a certain check on its worst excesses, because now there is a social audit in the form of social media. A journalist gets something wrong, immediately there is a counter on social media, and then often social media drives it. And so the danger of over-regulating electronic media is that there might be a similar regulator then asked for social media as well.
Yes.
So there's a very thin line between regulation and censorship. We have to walk it carefully.
Indeed. Sevanti, Nainan, I mean, the social media has been completely left out of all of this. Even the Supreme Court has not mentioned anything about the social media. No one's talking about the social media, because that's a place where, which is left for the fake news to come up, people bashing each other. There's so much happening on social media. Will we eventually see some kind of a regulator for social media as well, or do we need social media to be regulated?
I think it will be very difficult, because you have what does social media ride on? It rides on the internet. And you have a completely separate movement which says the internet must not be fiddled with in any way. You want freedom of the internet, you want access to the internet. So regulation of social media is regulation of the internet. Are you ready for that? Is anyone going to do that? That is the question.
Indeed. All right. 1 minute, so quick final comment from you, Professor Mukherjee. What's your final comment on the program?
I'd like to endorse what Mr. Hegde said, and I think that's exactly what was in my mind, that, there's the whole internet, and you're talking about regulating one part of it. In fact, a lot of young people now even watch their TV through the internet, and they don't make a distinction between what they are seeing on YouTube or the ADTV or this or that and the other. So that's my whole point, and there's far more objectionable stuff that comes there. Abuse, filth of a kind that makes you sort of recoil. Now, these are big issues. How do you do it? Can you do it? So these are not simple answers, and this thing, the whole thing about censorship, I think, is extremely important to keep in mind when we're talking about regulation.
Indeed. And final word and final comment from you, Navin Upadhyay. I'm going to let you close the show for us.
I personally feel, there is some confusion when we use the word regulator. I think somehow, we feel that this is going to regulate media. So I think perhaps, if we replace the regulator word with something like grievance redressal council, I think, I don't think anybody should have any problem with that. If there is a specific grievance, people should have the venue to go and lodge their complaint. I don't think media should be so scary to face the truth. When they are trying to propagate truth, they should themselves be ready to look into the mirror. And I think instead of regulator, I will propose that there should be a grievance redressal council.
Indeed, everything's in the name. All right, on that note, I'll have to call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Sevanti, Nainan, Mridula, Mukherjee, Sanjay Hegde, and Navin Upadhyay, thank you so much for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's all the time we have. Thank you so much for watching.